Before we get into your book, The Tequila Wars, Jose Cuervo and the Bloody Struggle for the Spirit of Mexico, which, I mean, who doesn't love that title to begin with? But, I mean, a lot of people, they drink the tequila, but they don't necessarily know that Jose Cuervo was a real person. They don't know that there's an actual city in Mexico called Tequila, or that there's a extinct volcano / mountain called Tequila, or that there's this region called, Jalisco, which is like the tequila capital of the world. Or if you actually have a bottle of tequila, it has to legally come from Mexico, just like, say, in the US with bourbon, say in France with cognac, champagne, etc. So, I mean, there's so many different ways to start this, but let's just kind of start with like the tequila side of things.
Yeah, well, I think you've done a good job of getting us into it right there. I mean, so I can tell you a little bit about how I got into it, and then how I found myself there in the region in the first place. And you know, my backstory, I think everybody's got a tequila story that involves, you know, Cuervo or Sauza, and usually some bad decisions over spring break, or, you know, in the basement of a fraternity house. You know, I have those stories too, but before even that, when I was a kid, my dad, he's a bat biologist and did a lot of research, did a lot of work in Mexico, and was looking in the years right before I was born at the bats of Jalisco, and specifically then was looking at some of the migratory bats that feed on the pollen and the nectar of the flowering agaves that are endemic to that region. And so he spent years in the area around Guadalajara and in the Tequila Valley, and got to know a number of the biologists there. And when we moved to Pittsburgh, where he was the curator of mammals at the Carnegie Museum, they had an international exchange program. And so he brought a bunch of those Mexican biologists to Pittsburgh, and many of them stayed with us. And as you can imagine, you know, they arrived with bottles in hand, and they would sit around at night drinking tequila and talking about the adventures that they had had together in that region. So I just kind of grew up fascinated by the area and wanting to see it someday. And so when I started freelancing as a magazine writer full time, one of the very first things I pitched was wanting to do something on the tequila industry. And what I had in mind was just looking at how, you know, tequila has soared in popularity, but it's, you know, made from a fairly delicate, finicky plant, the blue agave, that takes 7 to 10 years to mature. And because of sort of changing climatic conditions, and also issues sort of with overproduction and monocultures, the industry had this cycle of boom and bust forever. And so what I pitched was doing a story for Business Week, for Bloomberg Business Week, about the industry. And I thought that would sort of scratch the itch. I would get to see some of the places I had heard about since I was a kid. And I thought it seemed like sort of a great scam too. I was going to go spend a week going around to all the various parts of the tequila region, drinking tequila and getting paid to do so. And I think I wasn't halfway through the trip before I was like, this is more than a magazine piece. This is a book. I want to spend more time here. I want to get to know more about this. And the thing that really drew me in initially was just all the things you talked about, that so many of just the elements of the industry that I didn't know anything about, that tequila is a town, just sort of northeast of Guadalajara. There's another huge growing and distilling region in the highlands to the east of Guadalajara. Both are absolutely gorgeous areas that are really quite similar to the American Southwest, which is a region that I love. And that whole area of Jalisco is kind of, I mean, people often say it's kind of the Texas of Mexico, that it's, you know, cattle country. It's kind of where the charro culture, the cowboy culture of Mexico comes from. And so it was a place that I just felt really, really drawn to right away. But then over time, the questions that I kept asking everybody was like, this is so cool. I love the processes. I love the everything about the small towns and the families. But when I would ask stories about history, everybody just said, well, the history we don't really know. The history's lost. The history is gone. And so at a certain point, I just started getting more and more interested in the history, and still wanted to keep it connected to the industry as we know it now, and be sure that there was an entry point for people. But as I dug into that history, the thing that I found over and over again was that the reason that we know Jose Cuervo, that's the one name that we know, and even if we're not serious tequila drinkers, is because he was the sort of founding father of the industry as we know it now. And so that was the history that I started to dig into, and to try to tell some of the stories of the other families through him and through his legacy.
What is the difference between mezcal or mezcal, however we're going to pronounce it, and tequila? And are all tequilas mezcals, or are all mezcals tequilas? Can you kind of explain?
Yeah. So mezcal is the mother spirit. It's anything that is fermented and distilled from any species of agave is a mezcal. And so all tequilas are mezcal. And in fact, tequila, the original name for that was Vino Mezcal, which is to say a mezcal wine. Mezcal is approximately is the indigenous word for the agave itself, for the plant. And you get out into rural areas in the Tequila Valley, you'll still hear people, instead of referring to them as agaves, will refer to them as mezcales. And so that is really what we're talking about, is something that's made from agave. Now, originally, when people talked about the Vino Mezcal from tequila, that's what they called it, Vino Mezcal de Tequila. That's a bit of a mouthful, and eventually, it became so popular that people just requested it by that name, the name of the town. And people often ask, well, is tequila so much more popular than other kinds of mezcal because the blue agave is tastier, because it is, a better spirit? I think that certainly there's some part of that the spirit itself is, I think it's a wonderful, delicious spirit. I'm really a fan of it, but I think there's also a lot of other historical factors that really come into play. And, for starters, there's the proximity to Guadalajara as a major urban center, but then also, in the early days of the Mexican Republic, there were military roads that went from the coast into Guadalajara that passed directly through Tequila, that gave the town access to the city, but also to the coasts, and being able to move product up and down the coast. And so there was really just an opportunity for that industry to grow. And that's, I think, why now, as awareness of tequila and other forms of mezcal has grown, that we're seeing the rising popularity of other types of mezcal, that there's a just greater access to it now. Most of the other kinds of mezcal originate in the south of Mexico, just a little bit trickier to get it into the U.S. But that's also why then, as it turns out, a lot of the history of the tequila industry has to do not just with the production and producing enough to meet demand, but really distribution. It becomes a story of roads and of railroads, and them protecting those distribution channels and trying to open up markets in the U.S. It's really much more about building access than anything else.
I was watching this podcast in preparation for this, our podcast today with you, and the person was kind of like asking you why you wrote this book, because of course it wouldn't be turned into a movie. And I was thinking, like, why wouldn't it be turned into a movie?
No, I think
this should be this would be like an action movie. Basically everyone around Cuervo was essentially like taken out. And as you talk about in the book, the Cuervo essentially created the first cartel in Mexico. So, I mean, this would be like an action movie. This wouldn't be like some, slow documentary or docuseries or whatever we're talking about, right?
Right. Yeah, no, that was the part that I definitely did not know going into it. I mean, I expected, that there would be a story of business and sort of business conflicts. What I hadn't expected was that, first of all, Cuervo and the Sauza families were both deeply, deeply connected to the politics of Mexico, really from the middle of the 19th century up until the middle of the 20th century. And a lot of the politics of Mexico during that time period were, practiced through violence. And so a lot of it is about trying to stay alive. As you said, so many of Cuervo's competitors and neighbors were getting taken out left and right. And so a lot of it is about just trying to stay alive. But then it's also about trying to build alliances and trying to figure out, as the political winds are shifting, how to take advantage of that before your competitors do. And so, as it turns out, once I started digging into that history, what emerged was not just, here's a story of the spirit and how it got to market, but as you said, I mean, it's like, here's how Cuervo interacted with some of the major figures of Mexican history, Pancho Villa and Venustiano Carranza and Álvaro Obregón, but also then, how he managed not to get killed by their revolutionary forces, and then, as you also said, at the very end of that time, when the revolution had so completely destroyed everything in Mexico, here's Cuervo emerging with this idea of cooperation and, price fixing and working cooperatively and carving up territory in what becomes Mexico's first cartel. And not only sets the mold for the way that the narco cartels worked, but in the case of the Sauza cartel, that after the initial cartel fractured into Cuervo and Sauza cartel, that Sauza cartel to the east is the forerunner to the Gulf cartel that still exists today as a narco cartel. Those original roots and some of the original smugglers from the Gulf cartel had cut their teeth as smugglers moving Sauza tequila across the line from Tamaulipas into South Texas. So it's a very dramatic story, and it's I mean, the thing that's funny is that by the end, the thing that I was struggling with, in terms of like the narrative and how to put this together, I'm so used to, like, how do you make this exciting? How do you fill this with action? The thing that I ended up having a problem with was, like, how do you find some narrative pauses? How do you make this so that it's not just people shooting at each other for the last 50 pages of the book? And that, I mean, it became a real challenge. I mean, things really, really did unravel as we come into the end of the revolution and into the early Prohibition era, for sure.
I mean, you started this book, was it like in 2013? Something, right? So
that is correct. Yes.
Right. So it's over a decade. I mean, you released this or published this book in May 2025. And one of the big sources for your book was Lupe. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, how many trips did you actually take to Mexico? I mean, how hard was it to find Lupe's journals? I mean, I think you said for one of the diaries, there was like 5 copies. And I think for another one, there was like 1 copy.
Yeah, there was 2 copies. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So, I mean, how did you even find, Lupe's journals in the first place? How often did you go to Mexico? I mean, I'm always fascinated just by the process,
Yeah, well, as I said, in 2013, I thought, well, I'm going to make one trip and that'll be fine. And it was so amazing that I was like, well, okay, Day of the Dead's coming up. I'm going to go back for Day of the Dead, which was only a few months later. And that trip, it's interesting. The Day of the Dead trip was sponsored by Fortaleza, which is the brand owned by Guillermo Erickson Sauza, the great-great-grandson of Zenobio Sauza. And one of the stops on that tour that they do every year is to the tombs of Zenobio Sauza and Eladio Sauza, both characters now in this book. And it's typical on Day of the Dead to decorate the graves with marigolds and other floral arrangements. And so, sitting there with these two kind of titans at the graves of these two titans of the industry with their great-grandson and great-great-grandson, I was like, okay, I'm hooked on this. And so after that, it was, every few months I was going back whenever I could. And I did it partly with magazine stories, doing other magazine pieces, some of which appeared and some of which did not. But I wrote, more for Business Week and wrote about sustainability for Mother Jones. And so that allowed me to sort of get my way paid and figure some things out. And then, I sold the proposal for the book. And after that, the process was really trying to win over the families and trying to convince everyone that I didn't mean anyone any harm. I wasn't out to, expose anyone or whatever. I was just trying to understand the history. And it was in the process of, talking to people, and also then hitting what seemed like some of the logical archives, the National Archive in Mexico City, but also then the archive of the state of Jalisco in Guadalajara and the city archive in Tequila, just trying to see, what's here, what records are here. And it was in the secondary literature that, there are a couple of academics who have done some good work on the tequila industry. Rogelio Luna at the University of Guadalajara, and was the first who I talked to. And he told me, he was like, there was this niece who was the niece of Jose Cuervo's wife, who lived with them, and he and Ana, his wife, essentially raised Lupe from the time she was about 6 years old until she was an adult. And he said, there are these writings, but they're really hard to deal with. They're really complicated to just even sort of figure out what's going on. And I didn't know really what that meant at the outset. Once I finally tracked down copies and started dealing with them, I got a close-up picture. I mean, what Lupe basically did was take diary entries from years before, also write down some memories in late life. And they were all just these kind of impressionistic sketches. And they could be anything from, just the scattered memories of this neighbor or that neighbor, or a childhood memory that she couldn't really, place in time, but just sort of, they were just extremely impressionistic. But fortunately, she printed them up and distributed them to family members. And I don't know what the size of the editions were, but as you said, there's 5 copies of one left, 2 of the other that still exist. And I managed to track down, there was 1 copy of each, fortunately, in the US, which made things a little bit easier, and just started going through those. And in many cases, it was a matter of kind of reading and translating stuff that seemed pertinent, stuff that was said in tequila or stuff that was about Cuervo and his wife. But often they were so impressionistic that it was like, well, I'm going to have to figure out where this is in time. I'm going to have to figure out who these people are that she's talking about. And so it was that process, going through the archives bit by bit. By far, one of the biggest breaks was that the university, the National University in Mexico City, they not only have a huge archive of newspapers, but they have digitized most of them. So it was possible to go through the major newspapers and to keyword search, which made things much, much easier. But it was just a matter of sort of trying to establish the spine of a timeline, where it's like, okay, so here's when Jose Cuervo takes over the business. Here's some early mentions of him in the newspapers. Here's him interacting with the government, and that's in the government files as he's paying taxes or interacting in those ways. But Lupe's writings were the key, because then once I could start to figure out where things fit in time, she had this inside view of the household. She was able to not only give me, the kind of view that the business correspondence gave, where you're like, this is how many barrels of tequila are being produced, and this is where they're being distributed, and complaints about problems with distribution or lobbying to get a railroad built. But then Lupe's ground level view of like, well, this is what was happening inside the house. This is what was happening between my aunt and uncle. This is what was happening with them in the community, or between Cuervo and his brothers. And all of that material really helped bring things alive. And because she was so obsessed with their neighbors and with all of the members of the community, I mean, it's wonderful that she's essentially got these kind of small character sketches of absolutely everyone who floats through Cuervo's world. And so suddenly these things that had seemed like sort of scattered anecdotes became this rich archive of material and personal material on the people that were all part of Cuervo's world.
I find it fascinating because I was trying to do some research for this book, and I was like, okay, there's got to be like an autobiography on Jose Cuervo. You figure, like,
only
right? Like, once you find out that Jose Cuervo is a real person, and then you realize that this business started in the 1700s, and that even today they produce like 30% of all tequila, and then you're like, how do they not? And of course, when you think of Mexico, like, what's the first thing? It doesn't matter if you're from Europe or from the US or wherever. The first thing you think about in Mexico is tequila. Right. So I'm like shocked. Like, how is it that a guy from Nebraska is the first person to essentially create the Jose Cuervo biography? I mean, this is insanity to me.
It is unlikely. I will grant you that. And yeah, the thing that is funny to me is that I really think that this would all be quite different if Cuervo hadn't died young. And as I describe in the book, he died under pretty suspicious circumstances. It appears that he and his brother were poisoned at a dinner that they had together in Mexico City in early 1921. Cuervo was just 52 years old at the time. And you think about it, that's we're into early Prohibition era. Tequila as a product still isn't really known in the U.S. But within another 10 or 15 years, by the time we get to the backside of Prohibition, tequila becomes hugely popular in the U.S., becomes even more popular during World War II. If Cuervo had just lived out his days, I think he would have become a kind of prominent international figure and would have been asked to reflect on his career. He would have been interviewed in old age, might have done some writings of his own. But as it stood, he essentially operated the business for about 20 years exactly. And he spent that first decade trying to build the business in every way he could, acquiring land, getting railroads built, bringing electricity to town, getting new equipment, opening up international markets. So he was going to international fairs all the time and trying to, open up foreign markets. So he was rarely pausing to reflect. And then as soon as he's built up to the point that he's the industry leader, the revolution begins. And he spends the next decade trying to keep himself from getting killed, trying to keep his brothers out of trouble and his wife and niece alive, and also then trying to deal with the fact that tequila was attacked and burned 4 different times during the revolution. Guadalajara was burned 5 times, and so he's just in the midst of chaos that whole time. And then just as he emerges on the backside of that, the U.S. declares him an enemy of the state. That's not very helpful to your business when you're trying to export to the U.S. And then also, eventually enacts national prohibition. And he's right in the midst of still trying to deal with all of that when he dies. And so his life is incredibly action-packed, but he himself seems to have barely had a moment to catch his breath. And so that's the other thing, is that Lupe is kind of perfect as a person who is a sort of spy in the household, because she's got that youthful perspective. She's trying to understand everything that's going on, sort of getting a sense of who the players are and mapping out the changing political landscape. But she's also, she's a child. She's not well, so she's tutored at home. She's not at school. She's in the midst of the family drama all the time. And then as the revolution unfolds, she's kept at home for safety reasons. So she's just a young person with nothing to do but observe and write down what she sees. And so in many ways, she becomes the historian of Cuervo's world in a way that he just never was.
So you kind of mentioned like two inflection points for kind of tequila kind of taking off and having more notoriety. You mentioned Prohibition and World War II. What was it about Prohibition and then World War II that created this inflection point?
Yeah. So the first thing is that so we tend to think of Prohibition as this thing that runs from 1920 to 1933, and that is the period of national prohibition. But Prohibition as a state level thing was a kind of rolling proposition that had been coming on for years before national prohibition was enacted. And that's especially important for tequila because some of the earliest places that it was banned, that sales or public consumption were banned, were in the border states. And so from a fairly early point, there's this whole challenge of like, how do you get your product to market in this country where there's a lot of wealth and there a much bigger population, but there's essentially this barrier where you're not allowed to sell your product. That got even more challenging for tequila when the U.S. entered World War I, because there was concern about Mexico being allied with Germany. And so the U.S. put a ban on a bunch of Mexican products, including, an outright ban on importation of Mexican beer and alcohol. And at that time, right in the midst of all of that, started building the first sections of border fence. And so that you would think that would be a moment where tequila is kind of kept away from the American public and it becomes this thing that is inaccessible. But when you get to the moment starting during World War I, where not only is importation of alcohol, but production of alcohol is suspended, and then we go right into Prohibition, the bourbon industry is shut down. It is really tough to get booze from Europe. There's a lot of interest that suddenly emerges in tequila because it's one of the few spirits that is accessible. And so that creates this massive black market for tequila, and that is what really starts to spread the notoriety not only of tequila but of Cuervo himself and his brand. One of my favorite anecdotes is that Prohibition is enacted in January of 1920. In March of 1920, on the approach to the International Bridge in El Paso, there was a convoy of trucks that were headed from El Paso back across to Juarez, and all identical trucks. They all had their cargo covered with canvas tarps. The border guards thought that something looked suspicious and pulled the convoy over and threw the tarps back. And every one of the trucks was loaded with empty bottles of Jose Cuervo. And what it tells you is that within 2 months of Prohibition being enacted, that there were thousands and thousands of bottles that were making their way across the line and were being consumed in El Paso. And they were paying kids to collect the bottles and bring them back, and that they would be then shipped back to Mexico to be refilled. The thing that I also get a kick out of is that the border guards stood there kind of stumped for a while and eventually decided, we don't actually have any laws against sending empty bottles from the U.S. to Mexico. And so they allowed them to pass back in, but, recognized that they were all going to be refilled and they would be trying to intercept them probably within a matter of weeks. But that is the moment that everybody in the U.S. is not just looking for tequila, but starts looking specifically for Jose Cuervo and then later for Sauza, just a few years later for Sauza, and that they get this sort of massive presence in the U.S. It's a similar thing that happens again during World War II, that because we suspended the alcohol industry in the U.S. so that all alcohol production was turned toward the war effort. There was, the bourbon industry was essentially shut down from about 1942 to 45. And the same thing was happening in Europe with Scotch. And so once again, we started looking for an alternative. And the thing that's kind of an interesting confluence there is that tequila makes its way into the U.S. legally during World War II and starts to establish a presence. But also all the GIs who had been in Europe and kind of around the world drinking other spirits than whiskey for the first time come back, and they are now drinkers of vodka and cognac and just have a more sort of open mind toward other spirits. And tequila also then becomes hugely popular with the GIs who have returned after World War II, just as a sort of new drink. And that's really the period where we see not just tequila as a sipping alcohol, but that's the era that the margarita really takes hold and takes off as well.
You're kind of talking about some of the articles that you wrote about sustainability prior, kind of in the process of writing this book. Kind of an excuse to get back to Mexico and do some more research. And in 1974, the Mexican federal government basically established, kind of tequila as a Mexico product distinctly.
Right.
But also in that period, they essentially said hey, you have to use the blue Weber agave. And I've actually found this interesting that I always thought everyone probably thinks that it's a cactus, but it's not. It's actually a succulent.
That's right.
And there's something close to 200 varieties, and somewhere around that, and 80% of them are endemic to Mexico. But because of the fact that they created this kind of DO like they have in Europe, whatever, in 1974, that it has to be this blue agave Weber kind of type. But then all of a sudden now it just turns into this massive monoculture. And then you were kind of writing about how now a big trend was let's have these organic and let's have different techniques for creating tequila. And if you buy a bottle now of Jose Cuervo, a lot of times it won't even say añejo or is it reposado or however you pronounce it. Instead it'll be gold or silver, where it's okay, well, how much blue agave is even in the at one point was the preeminent brand. So it seems now Jose Cuervo maybe he's not even actual tequila. It's interesting.
Well, one of the things that I've discovered was that this whole problem of the agave being so delicate, first of all, as a plant, and then so susceptible to a whole range of problems, fungal infections and bacterial infections, and very sensitive to cold, and just a really tricky plant to deal with. And if you figure you got to keep it alive 7 to 10 years, I mean, the tequila industry still sees this. You could have a field out there that has done well for 6 or 7 years, and you get a snowfall and it wipes out your entire crop. And the same could be true of getting a fungal infection. And this makes having a monoculture a particular problem, because it's not just that it's all the blue Weber, but in fact, because of the way that many of these plants are raised, the agave will send up a flower stalk that then produces seeds. But if you do that, if you allow the plant to reproduce sexually that way, it's going to extend its life cycle. So it's going to take longer for the plant to mature. To get from seed to mature plant is probably closer to the 10-year period. But if you cut off that flower stalk and force the plant to send out rhizomes and it reproduces asexually, you can collect those, what they call iuelos, and plant those, and the plant will mature closer to 7 years. The problem is that iuelo is genetically identical to the mother plant. And so if you do this over a period of time, and as the industry has been for hundreds of years now, you can end up with whole fields of plants that are genetically identical. And so if one plant in the field is susceptible to that fungal infection or bacterial infection, or to that, to the weevils that will come and feed on the plants, every plant in the field has the same vulnerability. And so there have been instances, even in recent years, where especially the fungal infections will go through and will wipe out 60 or 70% of a crop in a region. What was interesting to me was to discover that has been a problem in the industry at least going back to the 1860s. And really one of the reasons that Cuervo and Sauza emerged as the leaders in the industry at that time was because Zenobio Sauza, the founder of Tequila Sauza, figured out that the fungal infection that was affecting all the agave at the time could be wiped out if you planted your agave in the mountains where the air was cool and dry. And so they started planting in the mountains north of Tequila. They started planting in the mountains east of Guadalajara. And he figured that out. And very quickly, Malaquias Cuervo, Jose Cuervo's father, also figured that out. And as the two people who had the healthiest fields of agave, they were the ones who kind of emerged. But as you might imagine, when you've got this particular advantage that you have because you've got agave and other people don't, then they also became the ones who were like, hey, to be authentic tequila, it has to be made from agave and it has to be grown in this particular place and in this way. And so some of that is tradition. Some of it is also, using your market muscle. And like you said, I mean, that continued right up into the 1970s where a lot of what was going on with trying to establish these government controls was to protect the name of tequila for that international market, but also to make sure that there was no counterfeiting, that which had been the other natural problem that comes when you have a shortage, when your crop gets wiped out. People will start making from other materials. As you say, I mean, there is a lawsuit that is going on right now that has been brought against Don Julio and against Casamigos, alleging that essentially that there's no agave in their tequila, that it's basically that it's sugarcane, that it's a white rum that has been then flavored and otherwise, colored and whatever to sell. And if you think about that, the simple reason for doing that is that sugarcane is an annual crop. You can plant it and you deal with it for 1 year. It's not this problem of having it as much as a decade invested in a field. And if you're selling at the volume that Diageo is with Casamigos and with Don Julio, there's a lot of market pressure to do that sort of thing. I don't know what the outcome of that lawsuit will be, but I think it's an interesting one because essentially what it is a labeling lawsuit saying that if you put on your label that you're 100% agave, 100% blue agave, that you can't make a product that says that, and then there's no blue agave in the product. And so it'll be interesting to see what the outcome is. I think it's a legitimate concern, but I also, some people get sort of a moral outrage about all of this, and I'm like, well, okay, but but this has been something that the tequila industry has been doing for at least 150, 160 years, and probably longer than that. So from a historian's perspective, this setting standards, but then also kind of stretching the standards or cheating on the standards, that's all very much a part of the history of the spirit.
Ted Genoways, your book, Tequila Wars, which we're discussing, one of the things I found fascinating was the Beckman family to this day, which are the direct descendants of Jose Cuervo, they still control Jose Cuervo. And like they're the largest producer of tequila, and it's of all of the top 5 producers of tequila, they're the only family-run company. The rest are all just kind of conglomerates that bottom out.
Right.
And so, but then the Beckmans also kind of, play like a fairly big role, at least the descendants, in actually creating this company to this day.
Yep.
So I mean that if you want to kind of talk about that the descendants of Cuervo.
Yeah, so they're a fascinating family for sure. So the Beckmans, the Juan Beckman, who was Juan Beckman Wilkins, the German consul in Guadalajara during the Mexican Revolution, that he was married to one of Jose Cuervo's nieces, which was something that Cuervo and his wife were doing somewhat strategically. They lived in the German district in Guadalajara and were attempting to get sort of interwoven with that German community, because they were the people building the railroads. They were the people building the hydroelectric dams and then running the power lines, and they were trying to get connections into that world. It also proved to be really fortunate for Jose Cuervo that the particular prominent German who one of his nieces married was the German consul. So that meant that there was a little bit of sort of that consular protection even during the revolution. After Cuervo died, the company moved into his wife's hands and then eventually moved into the hands of Lupe Gallardo, the niece that they had raised. Lupe's sister was who was married to Juan Beckman, and that's how the company moved into the Beckman hands, and it has passed from generation to generation there. And I think really interesting that, I mean, the current Juan Beckman Vidal, who is the CEO, considered selling the company probably a decade ago now. And at least according to legend and tequila, got right up to the day of the sale and then just couldn't bring himself to do it. Couldn't bring himself, to take this company that had been family owned for so long and sell to another foreign conglomerate, as you said. But at that point, he made this decision instead that he would make a huge investment in the town of Tequila itself, try to make it a tourist destination. And Cuervo has really done exactly that. And, I was probably as skeptical as anyone when this effort began, but they have done a remarkable job of, building a tourist infrastructure in Tequila, but in a way that is really, it's attractive, it's informative, it's really, really well done. And I think it has taken Tequila as a town from a kind of party destination to someplace that's more of a historical destination. And I think that's overall really good for the industry as well. And so their place in tequila history is fascinating. And I have to say, one of the things, there's a whole chapter dedicated to Jose Cuervo in the years right before the revolution, sort of remaking the town of Tequila. It brings the railroad to town, brings electricity, establishes a little tram that took people around the town, put a clock in the bell tower, put a new floor in the church, all of these kinds of improvements. Brought in running water to some of the larger houses, put in public laundries. It strikes me that what the Beckmans have done in tequila will be remembered in much the same way. That there was this moment of trying to decide what direction they would take. And what they decided to do was just exactly what Jose Cuervo did, was kind of double down on the town of tequila and reinvigorate the community. One of the things that's a great residual out of that is that has encouraged, as the profile of tequila as a spirit category has grown, it's encouraged a lot of the descendants from some of the other families that sold out to get back into the industry. And so it's also been exciting to me to see people who have maybe been, that their families have been out of the industry for a generation, or that they became sort of nominally involved, but no longer actually involved in the production side, have now moved back into the industry. And so some of the great smaller brands out there, I think, of Fortaleza, which I think is just a magnificent tequila, is made by the great grandson of Zenobio Sauza, Guillermo Erickson Sauza. There's Tequileño, that is a wonderful brand of tequila that's essentially right next door to Fortaleza, that is made by the José Cuervo family, which the José part of that name comes from the Southern Pacific agent who brought the railroad to tequila, another strategic marriage. And so they are making wonderful tequila on a small scale, and right there in the town of tequila, and those family legacies continue in that way too. So to me, it's a really exciting time, in not only in the tequila industry, but in the town of tequila, that you can go and all still on the same cobblestone road. You can see, the old distilleries that have been the family distilleries for Cuervo and Sauza for 150, 200 years. And then you can see the facilities that are owned by their descendants right down the road, and using maybe new equipment, but older processes. And so everyone always asks me, what do you think of the town of tequila? Is it a place worth visiting? And I'm like, man, it's amazing. I love that place. And so, yeah, I think that it's actually kind of a great ecosystem right now of large and small.
Getting access to Lupe's journals, was there any just like outrageous stories that didn't make the book just because it didn't fit, with the timeline, or, kind of your overall story?
So there was only one story of hers that one of the tricks was always like, how do you test her memory? How do you make sure that she's remembering this right, or remembering it in the right period of time? There's only one memory that I wanted to use it in the book so bad, but it was a strange thing. And the story that she tells is that she was in a carriage coming back from the theater one night with Jose Cuervo and his wife Ana, and that there was construction on the avenue, and that the horse sort of rode the wheels of the carriage over some loose bricks, and that startled the horse, and it took off with them still in the carriage. And she describes Cuervo getting thrown from the carriage, but then eventually, getting hold of the reins of the horse and bringing the horse under control. And it's a really dramatic scene. When I went looking through the newspapers trying to figure out when that might have happened, and it seemed dramatic enough that it would be something that would be described in the papers, what I found was a very, very similar story told in the newspaper that was about Jesus Flores, who was Ana's first husband. And I don't know what to make of that. It's possible that Ana was twice involved in runaway carriage incidents with her first husband and her second husband at the same place and in the same way. But it struck me that it was probably more likely that Ana had, or that Lupe had been young enough that she later on remembered this as being Jose Cuervo when it was really a different uncle of hers, Jesus Flores. But I just didn't ever know what to do with it. And it was a really wonderful dramatic moment, but if you don't know who the main character of the anecdote is, it feels like you can't really use it. And so that was the one sort of moment that I would have loved to have had for the book. And I would have loved to have had it for Jesus Flores if I felt comfortable that it was him. But I didn't ever feel like I could quite reconcile Lupe's memory with what was in the newspaper record.
In preparation for writing this book, you like I said, it's over 10 years in the making. I mean,
Yeah.
one, I guess, how many bottles of tequila and different bottles of tequila have you had? And then you have to have a favorite. I mean, what should people be? I mean, at this point, and you're 2 times James Beard award winner, so clearly you know what. So if I'm shopping for a bottle of tequila, I mean, fill me in here. Give me the secrets that you've uncovered here.
So I always try to be diplomatic about this because I have many favorites. What I will say is that the tequilas that from the town of Tequila that I just return to again and again. One is Fortaleza. I do legitimately love it. I can also tell you that, the Sauza family, Guillermo Erickson Sauza, has this incredible archive of material that is not only his own family's material, but a lot of material having to do with the Orandine and the Cuervo families. So I spent a lot of time in those archives, and Guillermo's a bit of a historian himself, certainly a history buff. And so we would often spend evenings debriefing from the research. And I mean, how can you not become a lifelong fan of a brand that not only lets you into their archives, but then in the evening you get to sit with the founder and drink the tequila and talk about what you found. I mean, that I have a real soft spot for Fortaleza. I'm also huge fan of Cascoin, a brand that is made in the village of Arenal. And I'm sort of a fan of it because it's Arenal is where Jose Cuervo got his start as an agave field manager and distilling for one of his uncles there. So I always kind of imagine that Cascoin probably is pretty close to the flavor profile of the tequila that Cuervo was learning to make as a man in his 20s. But I will also say there are fantastic tequilas made by the Camarena brothers in the highlands of Tequila, or the highlands of Guadalajara, east of Guadalajara. Ocho, which is made by Carlos Camarena. G4, that's made by Felipe, his brother. I will also say that one of the wonderful things that has happened is that the big brands have started to make sort of boutique products as they recognize the kind of pressure that has come from these smaller brands and what they bring to it. And so you get a brand like Sauza that has introduced these kind of limited runs in their Tres Generaciones line, and the product that they called Zenobio's Batch, honoring Zenobio Sauza. The Blanco that they made was, I think, a wonderful tequila. I feel the same way about Reserva de la Familia, the extra añejo that is made by Jose Cuervo. Still a very nice product. I'm especially a fan. I have to admit, when you go to the distillery, you can taste that Reserva straight out of the barrel, and at barrel proof, it strikes me as especially good. I wish they would do a barrel proof of the Reserva. I'll put that on the record. I would certainly buy that. So there are many options, and I'm always sort of sympathetic, having lived all those years in Nebraska, and now in Oklahoma. It's not like being in California or New York, or even in Texas, where there are so many options. And so, to me, in some of those places where there's more limited distribution and fewer brands available, it's exciting that some of the big brands are now making some specialty products that are really high quality as well.
And I used to to a bartend at this like affluent country club in Beaver Creek, Colorado, which is like one of the ritzier ski towns, and this is during the summertime. And I remember we had this small batch tequila, artisanal tequila, and from Mexico. And the guy comes in and he's just like giving it away at this event, of course, because it's just a bunch of affluent people. And he's like they can order this two ways and two ways only. He's like they can order it on the rocks, or basically it could be I guess without a rocks, maybe three ways, but you could basically have it straight up on the rocks, or if they wanted it in a cocktail, it had to be a Paloma. He's like if anyone orders a margarita, basically tell them to go F themselves. Like, we're giving this away for free. Like, they can do a Paloma, right, or straight up. And he's like, and then I was like, well, why not a margarita? And he's like, a margarita is not Mexican. He's like, it is That's American. True. And he's like, it is a waste of tequila. He's like, if they don't want to drink it straight up, like, at least do it properly, which is a Paloma.
That's funny about that to me is if you were bartending, that essentially the only difference between a Paloma, like especially a classic Paloma and a margarita, is that you've got grapefruit juice added. Like, so that's, so, I mean, the most Palomas will have a little lime as well as the grapefruit juice, and then some sweetener and the tequila. I mean, we're dealing with basically the same drink, but it is true. I have to say, I love Palomas, and I also have spent enough time in Mexico. I love a sort of classic high-end Paloma, but I also am not above the roadside Paloma that's made with squirt and like whatever passable tequila you can find that they have on hand. So it's what I love is exactly this, that the category is flexible enough that there are sort of great party drinks that are made to be consumed on the beach or on a nice sunny day, and there are high-end sipping drinks that are for more sophisticated settings and quieter settings. I love all of it.
Kind of last big topic before we wrap this up, just more out of curiosity, because you are a two times James Beard Award winner. And for people that don't know, the James Beard Award, at least to the foodies, consider it the Oscars of the food world. Sure. And I've been to, several James Beard Award winning restaurants, and, the food's always good. I mean, I think, I've always heard of the Michelin, like, oh, this is a 3-star Michelin. Like, that to me was always more well known. Like, I actually didn't hear about the James Beard Award until probably like 2018, 2017. And so, I mean, kind of what is the difference between like a James Beard Award and the Michelin star restaurants? And then secondly, like, what do you have to do to what are the criteria to actually be like this James Beard, award winning? I mean, in your case, author, but for people that go to a restaurant, like, what makes it this special sauce, so to speak?
Yeah, well, so the Michelin is fascinating in its history, because it's not a coincidence that it has the same name as the tire. That is actually its origin was the tire company that was trying to encourage people to take road trips, and if you're going to take a road trip, if you're going to go someplace else, you needed to know where to stay, where to eat, and so the Michelin Guide was originally intended just to let travelers know where they should eat. The Beard Awards are kind of of an American answer to that, named for James Beard, the chef, but also a cookbook writer and kind of popularizer of fine dining in the U.S. And so the idea is, to try to honor the whole range of American food. And so certainly the Beard Awards, there's the kind of elevated restaurants and the awards that they give for that sort of thing. But there's also awards for regional and for heritage sort of. I mean, like there have been awards that have been given out for barbecue and for as I say, I come from Nebraska. Nebraska has a particular affinity for what we know in Nebraska as the runza or the B-rock, which is essentially a meat and cabbage roll. It was a big deal when one of the sort of oldest places where you could buy B-rocks in Nebraska won a Beard Award. For me, on my side of things, they also honor, food writing and in recent years have added podcasting and documentary film and really anyone who's telling the story of food as well. And I deeply appreciate that side of things, because I do think that when we get right down to it, food and drink, I mean, what we're talking about is, of course, nourishment, but when we're looking at these things in the way that we're talking about them today, we're talking about culture, we're talking about history. And so to honor the people who carry those traditions forward seems important. The people who reinterpret, but also the people who preserve. But then to also honor the people who tell those stories and who find the people who are doing that kind of work and uncover that history. And so the Beard Awards, I mean, look, it's always nice to have your work honored and to they come with a nice sort of hefty silver medal that you can wear around your neck. That's fancy stuff. But the thing I love about the Beard Awards really is the gathering of all of these people who are doing this kind of work, getting everybody into one room, having people who care about food in all of these different ways and care about the culture of food and the history of food, and to celebrate that work. And also, as you might imagine, the drinks and the food are pretty good at those events. So it's a lot of fun.
So today's guest has been Ted Genoways. He is the author of the book Tequila Wars, Jose Cuervo, and the Bloody Struggle for the Spirit of Mexico. And normally I ask guests 2 final questions. I think we'll just do 3. We're going to do one just as where can people find you? How can they get a hold of you? That kind of stuff.
Yep.
One after that is just kind of leave us with a final thought. Something maybe we didn't talk about, something that's important to the book or whatever you want to leave the listener with. And then just kind of for this podcast, the third question is, what is your favorite restaurant? Something that a 2 times James Beard Award winner must eat at. So yeah, I mean, I need to know. So
all right, well, I'm gonna have to think on that third one, but while I'm processing the others. So the first is pretty easy. I'm not difficult to find. I'm on Instagram. I have my website is tedgenoways.com. You can send a message that way as well. And so I'm pretty accessible as a journalist. I try to be easy to find, and so I am. As far as kind of a thought around the world of tequila to leave everyone with, I guess just having talked about this being about history and culture, I do encourage anyone, if you have a deep love for tequila as a spirit, and maybe that's part of a broader love for Mexican food, go there. Spend some time in the country. Guadalajara is an easy place to get to. There are amazing places around the city there to eat and drink. It's a really sort of food driven city. And then out in Tequila and then in the Highlands and Arandas in particular, there are beautiful places to stay and to see, and everyone is incredibly welcoming. Everyone is excited to share this culture and this tradition with people who have made the journey. And I think it's safe to say that this is a moment where there's another kind of moment of strain between the U.S. and Mexico. And I think that it would be useful for people to know as much about Mexico as possible. It is a country that I just absolutely adore, and certainly a complicated place, but worth our time and investment for sure. Now, restaurant, some place to eat. Is this anywhere in the world? What are we talking about here?
Yeah, I mean, we got to strive for goals here. Come on, we don't need to keep it too. I mean, we're out here in Puerto Rico, so I mean, where you're at might be closer for us than Nebraska.
Right.
I mean, Nebraska's far away, so
right. So as long as we're talking about all of this, I will say my one kind of like can't miss place whenever I'm in Guadalajara. There's a neighborhood in Guadalajara that's called Tlaquepaque. And it's used to be a separate village, and as the city has grown up around it, there's just an extraordinary restaurant there called Casa Luna. It's extraordinary food. It's kind of elevated Mexican food, and all of the various regions are represented, but also has just a first class tequila selection, as you might imagine. Great cocktail program, and the interior of the restaurant is gorgeous and just really laid back, and is a covered courtyard that has been beautifully kind of lit and imagined. I love going there every single time I get the opportunity. I will also give a shout out, as long as I'm talking about Casa Luna, to say that more or less around the corner is a tequila shop called El Bujo. And El Bujo's mission is to have every tequila that's currently in production available for purchase at the shop. And so it's pretty nice to stop in, find a couple of like bottles you can't find anywhere else, and then have an amazing dinner at Casa Luna. So that always makes the journey to Tlaquepaque worthwhile.
My dear friends, that is it for this episode of El Podcast. Once again, if you're not yet subscribed, please subscribe on YouTube as well as Rumble. You can also find us on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts from. We thank you all from the bottom of our hearts for watching and listening, and we will see you on the next episode.